Hello and welcome to Chess with Simon. I'm Simon and this is Chewy. He's back, he's on my lap, he's back. Say hi, Chewy. Get his head in. How do we get his head in? There you are. And I've got a little bit of cheese for later maybe. We are going to look at another one of Peter Wells' games. We've looked at two already, but I've had a request for a third one. And I'm never one to turn down a request, so let's do this thing. Peter is white. Peter shows us an interesting way to play against the Gruenfeld Indian defence. We all need an interesting way to play against the Gruenfeld, don't we? It's a wonderful opening. It causes a lot of problems for white players. So, this move introduces the Gruenfeld. So, Peter's going to play the exchange variation. Now, the exchange variation shows... Hello, mister. The exchange variation shows both the strengths and the weaknesses of the Gruenfeld. So, it's a great place to learn about it. So... Right, the point is this. I'll let you get down, you'll come back later. The point is this. Black plays d5 on move 3. Now, d5 on move 2 is not such a good move. Because white can take, black can take, white can play e4 or other such things. But here, after g6, d5, if you take... you don't have to take, white doesn't have to take, but if white does take, black takes back. After e4, black exchanges on c3, and now the black bishop on the long dark square diagonal becomes really powerful. Because what it's doing is, it's attacking d4, it's putting pressure on d4, but also if white plays d5, it can take on c3 with check, potentially winning the rook. So that bishop is, as we say in the trade, a monster. So Peter played knight f3 on move 7. That knight can, in some lines, come to e2, perhaps after bishop c4. So knight f3 is not obligatory, but this is a very particular line. So rook b1 is the interesting move here. So what this is doing is it's an attempt to fundamentally refute this basic concept in the Gruenfeld. The basic concept being that you attack the d4 pawn with moves like c5, bishop g7, knight c6 with the queen on d8. You're attacking this pawn a lot of times and the pawn can't move in case the c3 pawn drops with check and possibly with a fork. So white is just moving that rook away from the fork. Black castles, sensible development of the bishop. So bishop e2. So in some lines the bishop goes to c4. But in this line, we're going to play d5 and we're going to hit the knight on c6. And actually, in some lines, the knight could come to a5, which would gain time on a bishop at c4. So it's actually happier on e2. And e2 can't be a bad square for the bishop, right? Black plays knight c6, and here we see it, this d5 move. So this is really challenging. So this sacks a pawn, and indeed, black can take the pawn, like this. White would block, and then it sort of goes... Now the knight has to do something. If the knight goes to a5, the issue is h4 becomes a really strong attack against the black queen side. So the bishop's gone against the black king side. So the bishop's gone, and, you know, h5, taken on g6, queen h6. You know, the knight is on the queen side. This is clearly really dangerous. I mean, the engine says that black might be able to hold it, so it's not losing, but it gives white a strong attack. Black's other alternative here, instead of knight a5, you can go knight d4, then white takes twice on d4, and what you end up with is an endgame in which white is a little bit better. So Kasparov played this way and won, and... this is just a better endgame, quite a lot better for white. There's a nice advance past pawn. The king is centralised, so white's doing pretty well here. So the point is, taking with the bishop is possible, but it is a bit dubious, and black doesn't do that. Black plays knight e5. So Peter takes the knights off. Then you have to defend this pawn, or you don't have to, but Peter defends the pawn with queen d2. Now, b6 from black. We'll go back a bit later on and look at where the improvements are. There's really two big improvements because white wins this game, so we've got to find an improvement for black. I mean, as someone who plays the Gruenfeld myself, I want to find an improvement for black, but it's subtle. I mean, it's really subtle. So b6 from black, looking for ways to develop that that bishop. White castles, bishop g7, bishop c4. I think you can play f4 as well here, but bishop c4 worked out well. e6 and now f4. So this is certainly hinting at a kingside attack. Bishop b7, but this allows, I mean, I've got to say, the engine's fine with this, but this allows takes here, and then takes here, check. So this has won a pawn, and we might be heading for an endgame, and it starts to look like it's going to set white up for a really nice endgame. King moves in the corner. It's virtually the only move you can take with the rook, but it loses an exchange. Rook b2 from white. The rook was attacked by the bishop, so the rook had to do something. Queen's come off. I think taking with the bishop's obligatory to leave that pawn on c3 defended. Black attacks it. White attacks here, and then black has a tactic here which looks good, but actually there's a wrinkle in it which Peter manages to find. So black has sacrificed an exchange here and then is playing here to get it back. But the move that makes this all work for white is rook d8. And this often happens when you have a pawn on the 7th rank. You often get these tactics that spring from it. Because in a sense, the big threat is rook e8 at some point. So here, rook e8 would be really good for white because it's forking the king and the rook can't take because then white's queening. So black has to spend a tempo on this, and if we just, I guess, take a second to breathe here, this looks like an endgame where white's a lot better and only white can win. I mean, that pawn on f7 needs to be nursed. It's defended by the bishop, and, you know, it's always creating threats. There are always threats associated with that pawn. White defends it and attacks the pawn on a7, and then with a4 sort of freezes those queenside pawns. Clearly black has a queenside pawn majority that he'd like to use, and a4 just stops them moving. King comes up to defend the rook, and then Peter starts moving his king towards the centre. All of this makes sense. So now, with rook e8, black can never take that, and black has to perpetually defend the rook on f8. At the moment with the king, but if not with the king, it'll have to be with the bishop. It'll have to be with something. I think these are waiting moves from black, frankly, just moving backwards and forwards. And then white starts advancing the kingside pawns, which makes sense. What we're going to see are threats associated with these kingside pawns. So what Peter does soon is he cashes in the pawn on f7 for a winning endgame, really. And I was trying to see if there's a different way to win, if you can sort of win by creating a zugzwang and just holding on to that pawn on f7. And I was playing against a computer, and you just about can. But the strategy of cashing in the pawn on f7 worked perfectly. But, okay, so first, black's played pawn c4 here. That must have been a zugzwang there. I mean, what... let's just look at what's going on here. I suppose the point is, the king is travelling towards the queen side, and I think black is virtually, so the rook can't move. For instance, if the rook goes to h8, you just take it and then queen when the king takes back. The bishop could move along the diagonal, but it can't move off the diagonal, because what you end up with is f6 check, and then the king can't stay in touch with the rook. So the bishop has to stay on that dark square diagonal, stopping f6, so the bishop can take on f6. So if not zugzwang, it's virtually zugzwang. And now Peter played rook e6, so Peter cashed in now. and there's a discovered check. Took here. Let's see the end of the actual game, and then we'll talk a bit about other possibilities. So, rook e6 check. What I think White's doing here is working up to winning that g5 pawn. I mean, White's 2 pawns up. If the rooks were off, it might be a little bit more drawish, but I'm sure I strongly suspect it's still one for White, particularly if the black king is far away from the king's side. So, but with the rooks on, it's a technical win. I mean, clearly if the bishops were off, it would be an easy technical win. The opposite colour bishops give it a slight drawing flavour, but not really. Peter gives a check on c6, and now the king is so far from the king's side that really black can't hold on. So black resigns in this position. So I suppose what I would say about this is, I mean, the play might have gone. I suppose, bishop c1 was a way to hold on, but then I suppose, or try to hold on, but then I suppose the idea is the white king just sort of goes d5, f6, starts to shepherd that pawn through, and there are just too many threats for black to cope with in that position. So what we've got here is, A, we've got a really nice system against the Gruenfeld, which is always helpful. B, a sort of very well played middle game, which set up a technically one end game, if we're honest. I think the helpful thing to do, perhaps, is just to look at where the improvements are for black here. So, the first one is, nowadays, I think, people are not so often playing knight c6. I mean, I suppose partly because of this game, which would have made people realise White's possibilities here. I think what we see more commonly, and I think the engines like this too, is takes, and then a check with the queen here. There are 2 ways to block this check. One way is to block with the queen, and then White is left with a slightly better endgame. And another way is to block with a bishop, which is a gambit, because this is now giving up the a2 pawn. So it's a beautiful position, isn't it? And it's such an odd position. So the queen is in a pretty strange position. White has a lovely centre. And this is a dangerous gambit. So this is dangerous for black. I mean, I've played the black side of it in correspondence and, found a draw. It's not, against a really good player, it's not, terribly, it's not impossible, but certainly there are a lot of risks for black in this position. So basically the modern handling for black players is on move 9, instead of knight c6, is to take, because knight c6 allows this d5 idea. Another point actually is, even after the d5 idea, you got b6 from black. I think nowadays people are playing e6 here. So in other words, people are trying to undermine and attack that white centre straight away. Then they realise now, and again this game illustrates this, they realise there's not the time for b6. You've really got to get on it. And you see this a lot in these hypermodern openings where you give white the centre. You can't, there comes a point when you just have to start attacking the centre. You get the same thing in the King's Indian 4-pawn attack. If you leave it a move too late, it just becomes overwhelming. So here, generally e6, then the game might go like this. Often goes like this, is the sort of mainline. Bishop c7, castling, white castles, takes, and then bishop a5, and then d6. So this is still an interesting unbalanced position, and I think a lot of white players would like to play this, but it's not, black's not in terrible trouble here, it's just an unbalanced position. But as I say, more commonly black's taking earlier on move 9, black's taking here, and this is really the main line that white players need to look out for. So I hope you've enjoyed that. That is the third game from Peter. We'll do more in the future, but I think next we're going to do one from Ray Keane, because the basic rule is activity on Twitter produces a game. So Peter started chatting to Ray about one of the earlier games, and Ray retweeted it. So we're going to do one next with Ray. I'm going to take out a piece of cheese. It's going to be half for me and half for Chewbacca. Cheese. Look, that's real cartoon cheese, isn't it? Chewie, you want some cheese? You want some cheese? Here he comes. Come on. Ugh. I've got to say, just this time in the afternoon, I really fancy a piece of cheese. I'm going to give him all of it, because you know he loves it. Look at that. I hope you're all well, and I hope you've enjoyed this. Thank you to Peter for creating so many interesting games, but the 3 that we've looked at, and we'll see you all soon.